So you really want to go with story first, and then, just kind of weave in the science. And I've found that working as a journalist, that sometimes scientists scoff at the idea of wanting to talk to a local journalist. Science and data should be the supporting element to that. And that's the way that you're going to pique people's curiosity. I think a big problem is not really about being in, say, a post-truth world. I think a problem is people aren't curious.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Caitlyn Looby, a scientist turned journalist based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She's currently the Great Lakes reporter at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Anything and everything that happens in, on, or around the Great Lakes is in her domain, and particularly, as we'll see, if there's an environmental angle to the story. I first came across Caitlyn and her approach to helping scientists to engage the public meaningfully in an article she wrote in the Royal Society of Arts Journal earlier this year, titled How to Get Trust in Science. It's a great piece, beautifully illustrated, like a 1960s Ladybird book, and we'll include a link to it in the show notes. Established fans of Data Malarkey will know that effective communication of science and scientific data is a hardy perennial of this podcast. Previous guests have numbered some of the finest science communicators around, including Tracy Brown, director of the charity Sense About Science, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, the Emeritus Professor of Statistics at the University of Cambridge, and Olivia Jensen, who runs the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk, based out of the National University of Singapore. Caitlyn looks set on a path for a traditional academic career, with undergraduate, master's and doctoral degrees, the latter in the effects of climate change on microbial life in soil from the University of California at Irvine. Postdoctoral research fellowships followed at both the University of Denver and the University of Minnesota. But it was during her time at Minnesota that her focus shifted to science communication. Writing about science for an intelligent lay public for the past decade, in June 22, Caitlyn became the Great Lakes reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel via Report for America. And at the end of 23, she gave a powerful, impactful talk titled Rebuilding or Building Public Trust in Science at TEDx Oshkosh. Indeed, I think it was this talk that brought Caitlyn to the attention of the Royal Society of Arts. Caitlyn's prescription for getting scientists to communicate better is threefold, and each tenet finds strong support on our podcast about using data smarter. First, they need to get local. Second, ditch the jargon. And third, find the story in the data. Amen to all three of those principles. We're all very clearly aligned. It's great to have you with us, Caitlyn. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, first off, can you tell me, is that a good narrative of how you've got to where you are today? Is there anything that I've missed out or anything I've got wrong? This is your chance to put the record straight.
I don't think so. I think that was a pretty good description. I've had quite an interesting career journey. I'm not even 40 yet, but I've already had 3 different careers, which, kind of fits my personality and, my desire to always learn new things and do different things to keep my brain active.
Very good. Now, listen, before we focus on data and maybe some malarkey that exists around data, I wanted to start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about the day job. So tell me, if you would, Caitlyn, how do you spend your time?
Well, now that I live in the Midwest, I have to say that my life looks a little bit different. It's a little bit more active during the summer. After living in Southern California for 5 years, I really am no longer a winter person. So, my day-to-day looks very different depending on the season. But now that we're shifting into spring, I spend a lot of time with my 2 dogs, Odessa and Olivia. We're frequently going on walks and hikes and doing camping trips. And I'm also a pretty avid stand-up paddler. So I love being out on the water, which really fits the job that I'm in right now. I also have to say I spend a lot of downtime too, just trying to get away from the news and get a little bit of a break. I'm also a very avid reality TV watcher, and that's something that I'm very proud of. Just trying to do whatever I can to get out there, explore, and give my mind a break outside of work.
Very good. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your postdoctoral research fellowships, which I know included some time in both Dominican Republic and Costa Rica?
Yeah, so most of my research, even through my PhD, occurred in these really cool ecosystems called tropical montane cloud forests. So they only cover like 2% of the entire world's land surface, but they're really cool. They, like they sound, they are found in the tropics, and they're also found on mountains. And they're really not what you would expect to be of like the typical tropical ecosystems that you may see on different programs and whatnot. They're actually a lot cooler because they're up in elevation. And cooler, I mean by temperature. Like I would go out in my field work wearing a sweatshirt, sometimes having jackets and gloves on. So they're a lot chillier than you may expect. And part of that means that things just happen a lot slower in terms of like plant growth and decomposition. So that's when microbes break down plant material. So I was kind of looking at how these ecosystems are being impacted by climate change. So there was a lot of great research that's been done above ground. And I was one of the first people to kind of start investigating what was going on below ground in the soil. So these ecosystems have been heavily impacted by climate change so far. Kind of like a key example are a lot of extinctions that have happened. So there's the golden toad frog, which is also usually used in like textbooks, and just a lot of things have gone extinct because they're warming really quickly. That cloud layer is moving up and they're just not getting as much precipitation like they used to. So I was looking at how this affected what was going on with soil microbes, so bacteria and fungi that live in the soil, and how that was affecting how quickly they were breaking down plant material. And that's really important because not only is that really important in terms of like giving plants and other organisms nutrients from plants breaking down, but a byproduct of that is also the release of carbon dioxide, which is a really important greenhouse gas, as we know. So that's what a lot of my research entailed, was hiking up to really remote locations, up mountains, which is no easy task in very muddy environments and whatnot. But it was really great too because I got to really observe the ecosystem that I was in and see a lot of these changes happening because I was doing that research. I think for about like 13 years. So climate change is happening so fast there that like even before my eyes, from the first time that I went to Costa Rica to the last, I saw a lot of changes happening, which was really remarkable.
And you're talking very much about living soil, the soil from the surface that has life, that has plant life, that has fungi in it, rather than kind of going back in time by boring very, very deep through soil. Is that right?
Yeah, I was just going on the top layer of the soil, really. I think as deep as I would go would be like maybe 15 centimeters. So very much that like top layer.
And can you tell us? It may become very, very clear very quickly, but can you tell us how you pivoted from scientific research to science communication? Had you become frustrated by some scientists' inability to communicate effectively with the public? What was it that motivated you and drove you to take this new path?
Yeah, so I think it was something, that was always going to happen. It was kind of a slow transition, but I've always really loved writing. When I was growing up, I was super, super shy. And writing was kind of the best way that I knew to express myself. So it's something that I always really loved and enjoyed. And I kind of always described myself not as a scientist who was trying to write, but as a writer who happened to be doing science. And I would say, like, by the time that I got into to grad school, I was always finding excuses to write. So I would apply for every grant, every fellowship, just because I wanted an opportunity just to write and tell science stories. And for me, science communication really started out in terms of outreach. So, like going into communities, especially when I was down in the tropics, having conversations, even writing some one-off clips about, the communities and like the great work that they were doing. And then that slowly just started transitioning. It was like one clip, then another, and then that turned into one internship, and then another, and another, and another. And it really just started realizing that, like, that was probably a better career path for me, and something that not only really excited me, but I realized too throughout the process of doing science that I didn't want to really just talk to scientists about science. I wanted to talk to everybody about science and kind of like help pique people's curiosity and sense of wonder. And I talk a lot about what scientists can do better. Um, but also too, like, I say that with a really large caveat, that that's kind of really constrained by academia and like higher ups in terms of these organizations. And I remember very specifically, in one of the last years of grad school, we had a seminar and somebody came in and they were talking about science communication. And one of the women who was in the cohort below me, she made a comment and it really struck me. She said something along the lines of, okay, not only are we supposed to do science, we're supposed to do field work, we're supposed to do lab work, we're supposed to be experts in stats, we're supposed to do all these different things, and then you also want us to do science communication. So when I talk about scientists, in terms of science communication and whatnot, I say that with a large caveat that not every scientist needs to be doing science communication. Not everyone is suited for everything, and there's so many things that scientists are expected to do, especially now. So, when I talk about this, it's very much which, like, with a lot of grace when it comes to scientists, and knowing that, like, you could be working 80 hours a week, and like adding something else to your toolkit is not always plausible.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. My business partner runs a consultancy that works with academics to find and express the real world impact of the work that they're doing, not just how many papers they're giving, but an impact is increasingly used. I know in the States as well as UK and around the world, genuine impact is increasingly used as a proper measure of what scientific progress is being made and social scientific progress. And very often academics saying, I've got to do this as well. It's like just troweling it on. Now, in your TEDx talk, you observe that studies that often get noticed in science are the ones that look at things from a big sweeping view, answering questions on a grand scale. These are the studies that get published in high-profile, coveted journals and get picked up by mainstream media. They help scientists get jobs and grants that fund their research. But this doesn't work for the general public. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit more, explain why that is?
Yeah, I think that statement largely came from a bit of frustration, just as someone who has written for international news, national news, and now local news. I see a lot with scientists that, like, they want to get their papers into really large publications like Nature or Science, which of course is really great. And it's really important that we find some of like these big global sweeping trends. But what's often overlooked is the fact that it's also really important to localize things. And I've found that working as a journalist, that sometimes scientists scoff at the idea of wanting to talk to a local journalist, just wanting to get their work out there to as many people as possible. But targeting like big publications in terms of like not only journals but media, like, that's not always the best way to have an impact with your work, especially when you're dealing with the general public. And when I talk about science communication, I largely do so within the framework of climate change, because that's something that I think about all the time. And it's just like important to realize that the vast majority of people out there, they can only think about what is going on in front of them. Like, there's so many things that people have to do throughout a day to day, so many problems they have to deal with, so many good things going on. And it's just like their frame of reference is kind of just what's going on within their day to day, what they experience, and what they know. So I think while it's really great that a lot of studies and scientists are trying to give that larger context, they aren't really necessarily the studies that are going to connect with your everyday person who, in the US likely doesn't have more than a high school education. Like they really just know what they know, and you have to work to bring them in to science. And that's okay, but I think that in terms of like rebuilding public trust and connecting with people, the best frame of reference is to go as local as possible and really connect. And that's why, in terms of science communication, one of the most important things is knowing your audience and then trying to localize things as much as you can.
You've answered my next question, which was why you think going local is so important. I want to in your RSA journal there were these three tenets about going local, about ditching the jargon, and then finding the story in the data. Let's turn to ditching the jargon. The Harvard psychologist Steve Pinker, friend of this podcast, previous guest here, he says in his 2014 book, A Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, that one of the biggest enemies of clear communication is the curse of knowledge. He defines this as the difficulty in imagining what it's like for someone else not to know something that you know. Can you connect this to your second tenet of effective science communication, this ditching of the jargon?
Yeah, I think it's really important just to realize that you can't have an effective conversation unless you're speaking the same language. And, everybody has their own language that they use, they have their own expertise, and you just need to make sure that you're getting on the same page with people. And I think like a big hurdle for a lot of scientists is just taking away that jargon and realize who you're talking to and wanting to make it as conversational as possible. And I feel like, a good way to think about science communication is you want to be talking to people about science in like you would talk to somebody at like a restaurant or a bar or out to coffee or something like that. Like you want it to be conversational and it should also be an exchange of knowledge, and you can't do that if you're not on the same page about what that language is and what those words that you're using. So I think it's important to also acknowledge too that everybody is an expert in something, and you just have to find a way to align your expertise with theirs. And a big part of that is using the same language and finding ways to connect.
And finally, and this, as somebody who calls himself and has been calling himself for many, many years a data storyteller, your third tenet is find the story in the data. How do you recommend, I don't mean on specific stories, but generally, how do you recommend that scientists find the story in the data with real impact?
Yeah, something that I've talked about in my science communication classes is like getting down to the basics of, when you were in kindergarten or first grade, like thinking about like what a story means and what the structure of a story is. And a story is something, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and the end. And it has conflict, it has characters, and kind of just really thinking back to like those things that you learned when you were little about what a story was and why it's so exciting. And something that I talk to scientists a lot about is you want to focus on the story first and then the science second. So you want to think about who your characters are. You want to think about what that conflict is, because that's how you're going to get buy-in from people about whatever it is you're talking about, whether or not it's climate change or public health. So you really want to go with story first, and then just kind of weave in the science to those different parts. Science and data should be the supporting element to that, and like that's the way that you're going to pique people's curiosity and sense of wonder. So that's just something that I like to tell folks is just like, for a second, put the science to the side, figure out what that story is, and then work science in around it.
I'm completely aligned with you. The day after we're recording, I'm going to go and train 30 corporate executives who work with data in how to communicate their data with more impact. But and one of the things and the exercise that we will be working through absolutely is about story and story structure, without becoming too elaborate, but kind of obeying the rules of how we both look to understand the world, look to navigate the world through stories, the story structure, and you're quite right too that I mean, I'm entirely aligned when you talk about the science and the data is there to support rather than to what it often does, I think, from the mouth of scientists, which is to completely overwhelm, to make people and I think that's fundamentally, I don't know if you agree with this, that's fundamentally down to a failure of empathy, a failure for the scientists to mind travel into what it's like to actually hear their stories. If they don't have any knowledge, they're intelligent, they have their own frameworks and their own knowledge and expertise, but they're not expert in what's being communicated to them. And I think it's down to a failure of empathy and humanity, and a respect for the data tolerance of the audience that some, not all, some scientists are failing to do.
Well, hello there. It's your host, Sam here. Now, I won't keep you for long. If you've been inspired by what you've been listening to today, and you'd like to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not go to our Data Storytelling Scorecard? Just follow the link to data-storytelling.scoreapp.com. That's score app with 2 P's. Answer 12 simple questions and you'll instantly be served with a scorecard that tells you exactly what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action and our brilliant guest.
From what you've observed, I mean, I know people might maintain that artificial intelligence has only existed since November or October 2022. We know it's been around for many, many years more. But from what you've observed since the mass availability of AI tools in the past 3 years, of large language models like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini, among thousands of others, do you think these are helping scientists to communicate more or less clearly than before?
I think it could definitely be helpful, but I think I say that also with a caveat that, it used to be that, at least when I was going through school, that like Wikipedia was kind of the bad guy in terms of like, you don't want to use that in terms of your assignments and whatnot. And then kind of people came around to it. And I feel like AI has become that thing as well. But I think just like Wikipedia, in terms of science communication, it should be used as a starting point and not the be all end all. Because, if you type in something to Chat GPT and say, I'm giving a talk to a local audience and this is what it is, like, think about key talking points. What's going to happen is you're not going to have your personality in there. And if your personality isn't in there, then you're not going to connect. It's going to come off as disingenuous, which a lot of people already feel like science is. And otherwise, it's just kind of going to be another version of a PowerPoint presentation. So I think it can definitely be used in terms of like, trying to think of analogies or other ways to say things, or, just like getting some ideas. But again, it should really only be a starting point, because when it comes to science communication, like, your personality needs to be in there. A big part of science communication is this need to humanize science and scientists and what they do. So, if you're just taking what you get off the internet or something like AI, you're just going to sound like a different version of a robot, basically. So I think it's important to maybe use, but again, like, just a big part of science communication is like, you can say something wrong, you can say something a little silly or stupid, and like, but just correct it and like make it just like a conversation in the way that, everybody else does when they're having a conversation with their friends or whatnot.
I think you raise a really interesting point. In the previous season, we had a couple of guests, a French philosopher of law, and also a data scientist, who were talking about one thing that is currently massively lacking in the answers that large language models give, which is what they both termed humility markers. So if you ask an LLM to structure you a presentation to give about soil microbes to a local community, it'll come out with a structure for you, and it will mine the world, and it'll find your work, your journalism, and your published academic work, and it will, it'll do the convergent thinking bit. But it won't say, I don't really know, or it won't say, I'm not sure, or it won't say, it could be this. It will give you a definitive answer. I mean, you can question it and you can push back, and it might say, good point. But there are no markers of humility. There's this absolute certainty. And I think it's fair to say that most people, even though there are now, adverts for prompt engineers, which was something that nobody would have heard of 3 years ago, maybe, or most people wouldn't have done. But most people aren't terribly good at writing detailed prompts. But also, most LLMs don't have any humility about them at all. There's none of that human-like. I'm not really certain. There's absolute certainty in it. So I think good advice, a good starting point, but your own personality and empathy and knowing the audience. Again, your point about knowing the audience, so right. Now, many say that we live in a post-truth world, or a world in which those who disagree with us have their own alternative truths, not based on fact or rationality, but rather based on emotion and belief. What impact is this having for effective science communication, do you think, particularly in your often polarized and politicized area of speciality of environmental science and climate change?
So this may be a bit of a hot take, but I don't necessarily believe that we live in a post-truth world, or at least I don't like speaking in those terms, because in and of itself, just talking like that is very polarizing and very othering. And it kind of gives a connotation where you can just throw your hands up in the air like, oh, well, it's a post-truth world, it doesn't matter. So I try really hard not to think about that, or to think like that, especially in a place like Wisconsin, which in the US, it's a very much like, it's a swing state. Like there's people here that like believe lots of different things and, probably are more on the same page than they actually think that they are. But something that I often think about is, there's a difference between trust and trustworthiness. So you can choose to trust someone even if they're not trustworthy, and someone can be trustworthy even if they shouldn't be trusted. And that can be due to like misunderstandings or past experiences or like a lack of familiarity. And I think that people are listening to other people that they think are trustworthy. And a lot of times that's the person who doesn't really challenge their worldviews, or at least fits within their own worldview. So like that's a way to connect with your audience and like find that like-mindedness. So I think what it means for me as a journalist and as a scientist is that I just have to work harder and find different ways to connect with people and like constantly be changing that. Like every story that I write, like even if it's a story about climate change or even something specific about like flooding, I try and target a different audience every time, and it shouldn't be the same, and it always needs to change, and there always needs to be an openness to like that exchange of ideas. And again, like I think a big problem is not really about being in, say, like a post-truth world. I think a problem is people aren't curious like they used to be, because so much about, when we're children, when we're children, we're so excited about science and dinosaurs and space and whatnot. And a lot of that is taken out of us, by society in terms of like, then it becomes about grades and achievements. And then as you become older, it becomes about like, making sure you can get that paycheck and like moving forward in your job. And I think, it's not so much a problem about post-truth. It's about, finding ways to make people want to learn again and be curious and get their sense of wonder and have it be something that is exciting again, because that's another way to connect and get people excited. And then you can get buy-in for certain things like like climate change or public health or other environmental issues.
I'll come back to public health very shortly. I'm completely with you. There's a book called A More Beautiful Question, all about the question why, written by a Harvard education guy, Howard Berger. And he observes that by the age of 5, children have asked the miniature scientist analogy for children. Children have asked the question why 40,000 times, and it takes them another 13 years to ask it as many times. They want to find out what the if and then contingencies are in the world. They want to understand how the world works, as you say, dinosaurs and space and the rest of it. And yet school and high school and university and then the world of work tend to validate answers rather than questions. And if we ask too many questions, we're seen to be awkward or talking out of turn or disrupting the class or whatever it might be. And I always encourage people to embrace their inner 5-year-old and ask questions and to recapture that spirit of curiosity in order not to be irritating or to waste time or to hold people up, but actually to get to the truth of the matter. And I think the 5 whys, the root cause analysis approach is a very wise way to go. Now, you mentioned public health. In your TEDx talk, you observed that fewer than 1 in 3 Americans trust in science, and that's a figure that's fallen since COVID. Science has gotten wrapped up in part in the culture wars. Is there anything that you think that scientists can do to effectively untangle it and to find common ground with the public?
Yeah, I think a big thing what scientists need to do is they need to challenge and put pressure on academic institutions, so higher ups, to really start rebranding and like changing what it means to be successful in academia. So right now academia really prioritizes that publish or perish culture where like you need to be putting out good papers, and big deal papers in those journals like Science and Nature or whatever the specialized version is in scientists' field. And I think academia very much needs an overhaul because there is no way to constantly be publishing and doing all this work and also be doing outreach. Like there's so many great people out there that are scientists that are doing outreach. They're doing science communication. They're doing things in terms of public policy, but that's something that takes away from them publishing or getting grants. And then therefore, like their work is not being prioritized. And there's just not that incentive there because then if you're doing that, you're not going to be seen as successful in terms of, other scientists that are getting those big deal grants and big deal publications. So I think very much academia needs to shift and it needs to do so quickly so that, it's not just about publishing papers, but it's about, that the person that is going to like a common council meeting or a board meeting or going out into the public and like talking with children or like writing like op-eds for different newspapers and interacting with journalists where like that it needs to become just as important as those scientific papers because you can put out as many great findings as possible, but if people don't trust you, it's not really going to move the needle that much. So I think it's really important that culture needs to change, and then that can give scientists room to do science communication or like become better with data or do whatever extra thing they want to do that can help rebuild public trust in science. That isn't just about putting an article into a journal that only scientists are ever going to read.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, I always draw the analogy between trust and being funny. If a comedian walks on stage in a club and says, "Hi, I'm really funny," it's like a scientist saying, "Hey, I'm really trustworthy. I've made it. You need to trust me because I've got my string of degrees and I've published here and there." Actually, don't talk about how trustworthy you are, don't talk about how funny you are, actually demonstrate why you are, exactly as you said earlier on, why you are worthy of my trust. Demonstrate through clearly explaining what your science means, the kind of the so what, now what questions. This is what the data mean, and this is what we should do as a result, rather than trust me, I'm a scientist. So I'm completely with you there, and I very much like your rallying call that academia needs to shift, and shift quickly, because the speed with which trust in all institutions of state, but many other areas too, has plummeted, means that this needs to be turned around quickly. Otherwise, we will be unable to know what to trust. I've got a question here. I'm not asking you to rat on colleagues, but there must have been. I want to know what the worst example of a misuse of data is that you've observed in whatever part of your career, be it more in journalism or in academia.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have a specific example. I do have some things that I see though that I definitely, tend to cringe a little bit at. One of those things is, the problem with correlation versus causation. That's a big thing that I see as a journalist. And not only, I mean, I talk about journalism, but now we live in a world where the media includes social media and it includes influencers, for better or for worse. So I think, not like the lack of understanding about what science is and what it means to do science is just a great way to do a disservice to science and data, and not understanding what it takes to be able to say anything definitively and with evidence. And I think, a problem too, especially that I see in journalism, is, folks not being really critical about where a study or report is coming from, who is writing that, who funded that research, who is it being targeted towards, and really that skepticism in terms of like, it may be a report that has numbers and whatnot. That doesn't mean that it's good science, or even science at all. So I think it's the two things I would say is correlation versus causation, and also just like being skeptical with reports and studies when you see them, about why they were done and who they were done by, and just understanding that like that doesn't mean you necessarily have to throw it out, but like you need to have that caveat in there that like, this may be a little bit skewed or be a little bit biased.
Correlation is not the same as causation. There was a fantastic, The Economist published on April Fool's Day a few years ago, the correlation between chocolate consumption and number of Nobel laureates. And Switzerland did remarkably well at both. It was top of the charts. It was amazing, and it plotted along a sort of an R squared value of about sort of 0.9. Clearly not remotely related to one another. I'm sure you also know of the excellent repository spuriouscorrelations.com, created by Tyler Vegan. If not, I strongly recommend you look it up. One of my favorite ones is the correlation between cheese consumption and the number of people who die getting strangulated in bed sheets, because of course, as we all know, when you eat a lot of cheese you have bad dreams, or Nick Cage movies and people drowning in swimming pools. So if you ever see there's a new Nick Cage movie out, don't go in your swimming pool. Right? No, I think that's a perfect example. I've got what I might call a Columbo question. Kind of just one more thing. In the way that you work with data and explaining science clearly, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think I should have asked you?
That's funny. That's always the last question that I ask when I do interviews as a journalist. I think something, I guess if I would want to leave people with a certain point about science communication, is that again, it needs to be an exchange of of ideas. It shouldn't be just, another forum to talk at people. And I think it's really important to understand where people are coming from, understand what their viewpoints are. I really do think that people have a lot more in common than they think they do. It's just we have all these loud voices on social media and with politics, and whatnot. And I think when it comes down just to like your core everyday person, like I think we can get on the same page a lot easier than that we think we can. And so I think it's really important that, a big part of science communication is also listening and just making sure that you have that openness and wanting to have conversations and, not just give another PowerPoint presentation at people.
Very good. Very good. Good rallying cry. Finally, Caitlyn, where can our listeners and our viewers find out about you, your work, what you're up to online in social media and so on?
Yeah, I think the best place to go and look at my work would just be on the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel's website. There's a list of all my stories on there. And, like you mentioned in the beginning, it's not just environmental stories. It's about weird things at the bottom of the Great Lakes or explaining different science things, talking to nature photographers that I see on my dog walks, all sorts of things to really, localize what's going on in this world and what's going on specifically within the Great Lakes.
Perfect. Well, I'll also include a link to your TEDx Oshkosh talk and to your RSA Journal article. Thank you so much for your time, Caitlyn. I think if there were more people with your approach to using data smarter, there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of science communication and rather more data-driven common sense. Caitlyn Looby, thank you so much for joining us on Data Malarkey.
Thank you so much.